In the weeks after June 6, 1944, the fields and hedgerows of Normandy became a crucible unlike anything American pilots or infantry had ever seen. A landscape so dense, so claustrophobic, and so lethal that every assumption the U.S. Army had made about modern warfare collapsed almost immediately, forcing the men of the 9th Air Force and its P-47 Thunderbolt squadrons to invent an entirely new way of fighting from the sky. The bocage country surrounding Saint-Lô, Carentan, and Caumont resembled a green maze, thick earthen walls covered in vines and shrubs, each hedgerow rising nearly head-high, boxing every farm field into a natural fortress. For the American infantry slogging through it, every 100 meters became a separate battle. For the Shermans trying to support them, visibility shrank from miles to yards, and the armor advantage they counted on evaporated under the barrels of concealed Panzerfaust teams and Pak-40 anti-tank guns. Wehrmacht units like the 352nd Infantry Division, 2nd Panzer Division, and elements of Panzer Lehr exploited this terrain with brutal efficiency, waiting until American tanks emerged from the shadow of a hedgerow before blasting them from mere meters away. The U.S. Army, accustomed to maneuver warfare and open-field advances, suddenly found itself pinned down, unable to see, unable to move, unable to coordinate enough firepower to break the German defensive web. Artillery, usually the backbone of American offensive doctrine, struggled as well. The canopy of hedgerows made spotting nearly impossible. Forward observers could not see more than a few dozen yards, and German counter-battery fire punished any attempt to bring guns closer to the line. Infantry commanders sent message after message up the chain. They needed fire support that could arrive within minutes, not hours, and strike targets hidden from ground view but visible from above. They needed something faster than artillery, more flexible than tanks, and more precise than strategic bombers. And so attention turned to the aircraft that had already been flying low over Normandy, strafing rail lines and attacking columns before D-Day, the rugged, heavily armed Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. At the start of the campaign, P-47 pilots were still operating under pre-Normandy doctrine: fly pre-planned missions, strike pre-assigned targets, and operate independently of ground units. That was how air power had been used in North Africa and Italy, valuable but not responsive enough for the chaos unfolding among the hedgerows. The problem, as after-action reports quickly made clear, was that German units could reposition faster than pre-planned airstrikes could be approved. Without real-time communication between pilots and ground officers, the Thunderbolts often arrived too late or hit empty fields. The battlefield was moving minute by minute, and air power wasn't moving with it. The breakthrough came from desperation. Officers of the 9th Tactical Air Command, supporting the 1st U.S. Army under Omar Bradley, realized no conventional doctrine could solve the bocage problem. If infantry could not see the battlefield, but pilots could, then aircraft and ground troops needed to function as one entity, sharing information instantly, directing strikes dynamically, and operating on the same net. This meant something revolutionary, giving ground officers direct control over fighter-bombers in flight. For the first time in American history, small teams of air officers, Tactical Air Control Parties, or TACPs, embedded themselves with divisions, regiments, and sometimes even battalions. They carried SCR-300 radios, aerial target maps, colored smoke grenades, and call sign sheets connected to airborne P-47 Thunderbolts. At first, both sides, air and ground, were uncertain. Pilots feared friendly fire in the hedgerow chaos. Ground officers doubted that aircraft flying at 250 to 300 miles per hour could strike targets hidden behind earthen walls. But the first coordinated missions proved that not only was it possible, it was transformative. When infantry in the 29th and 30th Divisions encountered fortified farmsteads or dug-in anti-tank guns that halted their advance, a single radio call could bring a Thunderbolt diving out of the sky in under 10 minutes. When Sherman tanks were pinned by Panthers prowling the hedgerow shadows, TACPs marked the enemy with colored smoke, and P-47s rolled in with bombs or .5 caliber strafing runs that broke the ambush instantly. Infantry who had spent hours pinned behind hedgerows suddenly heard the roar of radial engines and watched German positions erupt in flame. Tanks that once hesitated to move forward now advanced behind a curtain of air power. This fusion of air and ground was not smooth at first. It required new tactics improvised on the fly. P-47s learned to fly extremely low over pocage lines to identify targets. FACs adapted their terminology to point pilots toward landmarks visible from the air, church spires, crossroads, orchard clusters, rather than ground-level features hidden by hedges. Every day in June and July, the system improved. The battlefield that had once neutralized American firepower now gave birth to a new kind of warfare: responsive, precise, and dynamic close air support. Normandy didn't just force innovation, it forced transformation. The P-47 pilots of the 9th TAC and their ground counterparts were not following doctrine, they were writing it in real time. By July 1944, the American Army had something no army in history had possessed: the ability to summon devastating, accurate air power within minutes, coordinated at the small unit level. What began in the claustrophobic nightmare of the hedgerows would soon become the foundation of modern close air support doctrine for the next 80 years.
By late June 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer just a high-altitude escort or a rail yard attacker. It was becoming something entirely new, something its designers at Republic Aviation had never fully envisioned. The Thunderbolt, with its massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine, 8.50 caliber machine guns, and famously rugged airframe, found itself uniquely suited to the brutal, close-quarters fighting inside the Normandy hedgerows. But to transform the P-47 from a traditional fighter bomber into the world's first truly modern CAS platform, its pilots had to relearn how to fight from the sky. They needed to fly lower, slower, tighter, and far more precisely than any training syllabus had prepared them for. The Thunderbolt pilots of the 9th Air Force's IX Fighter Command, men of the 362nd, 365th, 366th, and particularly the legendary 404th Fighter Group, were suddenly thrust into a kind of warfare that demanded both nerve and invention. Their earlier combat experience in Italy and North Africa helped them survive, but Normandy forced them to innovate. German anti-aircraft defenses were everywhere, from 20mm flak Veerlings hidden in barns to 88mm guns disguised inside orchards. Flying low meant flying into a storm of fire, yet it also meant seeing what the infantry could not, and that was the key to unlocking the Bocage battlefield. The first adaptation came from necessity. Altitude was useless. High-altitude bombing could not strike targets concealed beneath hedgerow canopies. Instead, P-47s descended to treetop level, sometimes flying so low that infantry could see the pilots' goggles glint as the aircraft roared over their heads. This ultra-low flight profile allowed Thunderbolt pilots to identify German strongpoints, machine gun nests, mortar crews, anti-tank teams, and camouflaged vehicles that ground forces could not reach without heavy casualties. Shell-shocked infantrymen in the 1st and 4th Divisions later described P-47s diving between the hedges rather than above them. But spotting the enemy wasn't enough. Communication had to evolve too. Normandy became the laboratory where new air-ground communication techniques were invented. The SCR-300 walkie-talkie and SCR-522 VHF radios formed the lifeline between pilots and forward air controllers on the ground. Before Normandy, a pilot might receive a target assignment an hour before takeoff. Now he could receive it 10 seconds before releasing his bombs. FACs, often riding in jeeps with whip antennas, took enormous risks to position themselves close enough to the enemy to mark targets with smoke or tracer fire. Many of these air controllers belonged to the newly formed Tactical Air Control Parties, an innovation that fundamentally altered the nature of air support. These controllers, often stationed with regimental and divisional HQs, acted as translators between the battlefield and the sky. They watched the unfolding fight, relayed precise coordinates in real time, and fed a constant stream of updates to orbiting P-47s waiting in cab rank formations above the front. This cab rank system, borrowed later by the RAF, became one of the defining breakthroughs of modern CAS. Instead of launching aircraft only after targets were confirmed, Thunderbolts orbited continuously, like airborne artillery batteries ready to fire at a moment's notice. When a TACP called in a strike, the nearest P-47 simply peeled off the stack and dove, cutting response time from hours to minutes. The next challenge was accuracy. In the bocage, a bomb dropped 50 meters off target could do more harm than good. Pilots trained to hit rail yards now had to place bombs inside tiny fields no larger than tennis courts. Squadron diaries from the 365th and 404th Fighter Groups reveal how quickly pilots adapted. They began using snap dives at low angles, releasing ordnance at lower altitudes, and timing their bomb release based on hedgerow gaps. They developed shorthand radio codes to coordinate with controllers: Rhubarb, Judy, Drop 1, Running Fire, and the famous Scratch 1 Panther after P-47s destroyed German tanks during the Mortain counterattack. Every success reinforced their transformation. When infantry broke through a hedgerow but were pinned by fire from the next one, a single radio call could bring down a rolling wall of .50 caliber fire across the German line. When a Sherman troop spotted a Panther lying in ambush, they could pop smoke, fall back, and let Thunderbolts handle the killing blow. One German officer from Panzer Lehr later admitted that P-47s forced his tanks to operate like blind men, unable to maneuver without being seen and struck within minutes. The Thunderbolt itself proved ideal for the evolving mission. Its ruggedness was legendary. Pilots routinely returned to base with cylinders shot out of their engine, holes in their wings large enough to crawl through, or flak fragments lodged in their oil coolers. A Messerschmitt could not survive that kind of punishment. P-47 could, and keep fighting. Its 8.50 caliber guns, firing up to 100 rounds per second, shredded trucks, exposed infantry, and light armor. Against German heavy armor, Thunderbolts used 500 and 1,000-pound bombs, or 4.5-inch M8 rockets, to disable mobility, blow tracks, or destroy vehicles outright. These attacks were terrifyingly effective. Wehrmacht's reports described P-47 squadrons as jabos, whose sudden dives annihilated entire columns before the Germans had time to react. But perhaps the biggest breakthrough was psychological. American ground troops began to view the P-47 not as a distant asset, but as a partner, an extension of their artillery and their will to advance. Soldiers who had never interacted with airmen before now fought alongside them in a shared rhythm. Infantry pinned down, TACP calls in a strike, P-47 rolls in, explosion shakes the hedgerows, and infantry advances. It was a seamless dance of destruction and movement that no army had achieved before 1944. What Normandy taught the Thunderbolt pilots was simple, yet profound. Close air support was not an afterthought or a specialty. It was the backbone of modern combined arms warfare. And by the end of July, the P-47 pilots of the 9th Air Force understood something that would shape the rest of the war and every war after it. They were no longer just fighter pilots. They were the eyes, fists, and firepower of the American ground advance itself.
By July 1944, the improvisations born in the hedgerows had hardened into something far more powerful than battlefield improvisation. They had become a system, a doctrine in all but name, one that allowed P-47 Thunderbolt pilots and American ground troops to function as a single organism. What emerged in Normandy was the first fully integrated air-ground coordination network in the history of warfare, a real-time strike system built around shared radios, standardized communication procedures, and a revolutionary concept known as the cab rank. Before Normandy, air power struck what commanders ordered hours earlier. After Normandy, air power struck what infantry saw seconds earlier. That shift, as simple as it sounds, rewrote the logic of land warfare. The heart of this new system was the Tactical Air Control Party, the TACP, Usually a small team of just 3 or 4 men traveling in a jeep equipped with an SCR 300 backpack radio, map boards, aerial overlays, and smoke markers. Positioning themselves dangerously close to the front line, they acted as the brain that linked ground forces to the sky. Infantry officers began relying on these teams as heavily as on their artillery liaisons, because the TACP could do what no other unit could: summon a P-47 strike in under 10 minutes. The speed alone changed everything. German counterattacks that once relied on surprise now found themselves exposed before they even reached the line. Tanks massing behind a hedgerow to prepare for an assault could be spotted by scouts, reported by the TACP, and bombed by P-47s before they ever moved forward. To make this possible, the 9th Tactical Air Command established a layered communication structure. The Air Support Control Center, AFCC, filtered incoming requests. Air support parties at division level organized priorities, and TACPs pushed strikes directly into the hands of platoons and companies. This hierarchy allowed pilots to receive intelligence from multiple sources at once: ground observers, reconnaissance aircraft, and even Allied intercept units listening to German radio traffic. But the true genius of the system lay in the cab rank. Instead of sending aircraft only after a request, P-47 squadrons orbited continuously above the front in a stacked circular pattern: 10, 20, sometimes 30 aircraft in fuel-efficient turns, waiting for a TACP to call them in. When the call came, the nearest aircraft broke from the circle, dived almost instantly, made its attack run, then climbed to rejoin the queue. This created a conveyor belt of destruction, a steady stream of strikes capable of hitting dozens of targets per hour. German officers who survived the Normandy campaign later admitted that this system left them disoriented. It was not the air-ground system they had fought in Poland or France or the Soviet Union. There, the Luftwaffe had operated from central direction, attacking in pre-planned waves. Normandy was something else entirely. American air power responded with the speed of a reflex, not the deliberation of a plan. Wehrmacht diaries describe the frustration of hearing an engine roar overhead only minutes after their scouts reported American movement. "They are called by radio, like artillery that flies," one German infantry officer wrote. The precision of the strike stunned both sides. P-47 pilots, trained in high-speed dive attacks, now improvised techniques to ensure accuracy inside the bocage. Pilot accounts from the 362nd, 365th, and 404th Fighter Groups describe how they began using hedgerows as alignment guides, rolling into dives parallel to the foliage, timing bomb releases to hit fields no larger than a small barn. They practiced skip bombing with 250 and 500-pound bombs when striking wooded edges or hardened farmhouses. Against German armor, they honed devastating combinations: 50 caliber strafing to blind tank crews and force them to button up, followed by rockets or 500-pound bombs to break tracks or detonate fuel. Even the dreaded Panthers and Tigers found themselves vulnerable when caught from above, where their armor was far thinner. Ground units watched in awe as this air-ground marriage reshaped their battles. During the drive toward Saint-Lô, when infantry found themselves unable to advance even 50 meters without taking machine gun fire, TACPs marked the enemy with smoke, and P-47s rolled in to plow the positions flat. During the assault on Villiers-Fossard, a battalion of the 29th Division nearly collapsed under a German counterattack before thunderbolts arrived and smashed the assault by destroying half a dozen vehicles in minutes. The after-action report simply stated, "The air saved us." The German High Command recognized the danger almost immediately. Field Marshal Günter Klug warned Berlin that American tactical air power was binding our forces in daylight, preventing movement, regrouping, or resupply. Panzerlehr, once considered Germany's finest armored division, suffered catastrophic losses not only from artillery, but from constant P-47 harassment during every attempt to maneuver. Trucks, supply convoys, and even bicycle troops were annihilated along roads that once offered safe movement. What made this new system even more transformational was how seamlessly the pilots adapted to the demands of the infantry. They learned to identify friendly panels, colored smoke, and tracer patterns. They avoided strafing marks near advancing U.S. flags or orange-painted recognition cloths. Mistakes still happened, but far fewer than anyone expected for a battlefield this chaotic. Pilots flew so low that infantry often shouted thanks at them as they pulled up, and in many cases, pilots returned to base with foliage caught in their oil coolers from clipping hedgerows during their dives. Normandy's rapidly evolving CAS system also introduced standardized terminology that would shape post-war doctrine. FACs developed shorthand like armored target, moving, dug-in machine gun, or guns red, wait, precursors to today's 9-line CAS brief. P-47 pilots learned to coordinate orbit patterns, headings, and safe withdrawal lines so that multiple aircraft could strike safely without colliding or hitting friendly troops. Every successful mission fed back into daily briefings, refining tactics at breathtaking speed. By late July, the U.S. Army had something no other military possessed, an air-ground system that could vaporize a German counterattack in under 15 minutes. Thunderbolts were no longer just aircraft, they were the fast-moving artillery batteries of an army that now fought with vertical firepower as naturally as horizontal. By late July 1944, the American front in Normandy had reached a breaking point. After 6 brutal weeks of hedgerow fighting, the U.S. First Army finally stood on the threshold of a breakout. The plan, Operation Cobra, called for an explosive thrust west of Saarlouis, smashing through the German line and unleashing armored divisions into the open country beyond. But what made Cobra possible was not only a carpet of B-17s on the opening morning. It was the lethal, responsive, and precise close air support system that the P-47 Thunderbolt had perfected in the hedgerows. Once the infantry breached the German defensive crust, CAS would become the spearhead of the breakout. On July 25th, after the thunder of strategic bombers lifted, the U.S. 7th Corps surged forward into terrain that finally allowed speed. The Germans, badly shaken and half-blinded by dust and smoke, attempted to reorganize, but the moment they began pulling back or repositioning forces, the P-47s were already overhead. TACPs riding with the leading infantry sent a flurry of contact reports to the IX Tactical Air Command, marking roads, intersections, and hedgerows where German troops were trying to regroup. Thunderbolts poured into the gaps like water. Their cab ranks were stacked so deeply that some pilots joked they could walk on Thunderbolt wings from Isigny to Coutances. P-47 pilots strafed in rocketed columns attempting to escape south. German supply convoys, already devastated by weeks of interdiction, were torn apart repeatedly as they tried to flee through narrow lanes. Panzer Lehr, already mauled by artillery and bombers, lost its remaining trucks, guns, and armored cars to constant Thunderbolt attacks. German officers later described Cobra as a situation where every movement, no matter how small, triggered an airstrike. The interdiction was not random, it was coordinated, systematic, relentless. But even the devastation of Cobra paled in comparison to what happened 10 days later at Mortain, where the modern concept of CAS proved its worth in one of the most dramatic defensive battles of the Western Front. On July 7, 1944, Hitler ordered a desperate counteroffensive, Operation Lüttich, a last attempt to cut off the American spearheads and drive them back to the coast. 4 panzer divisions, including the elite 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, lunged toward the town of Mortain, striking the positions of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division. The attack initially achieved surprise. Thick fog covered the battlefield, preventing Allied aircraft from flying. German tanks punched through outposts and threatened to reach the high ground that controlled the American supply lines. For a few terrifying hours, it seemed the entire breakout might collapse. But as the morning mist began to lift, the world changed. One by one, the low clouds burned off, and the thunderbolts came. The first P-47s of the 362nd Fighter Group arrived just after 10 a.m. Within minutes, they were followed by the 365th, the 366th, and the 404th. Then came the RAF Typhoons. Mortain became an aerial gauntlet. TACPs on the ground, fighting from foxholes and burning vehicles, directed P-47s onto German armor using radio bursts and smoke grenades. Pilots dove through still-lingering mist, firing rockets and .5 caliber bursts at Panthers, half-tracks, and support trucks. By noon, cab ranks stretched from Avranches to the horizon. German tank crews later recalled watching thunderbolts circle above them like hawks over rabbits. Every attempt to withdraw or reposition drew a swarm of aircraft. The after-action reports tell the story with brutal clarity. In the span of just 2 days, P-47s claimed the destruction or disablement of more than 100 vehicles, armored and soft-skinned, while preventing the Germans from mounting any coordinated follow-up attack. The U.S. 30th Division held its ground, and the German counteroffensive, meant to turn the tide of the war, instead broke apart under the weight of air power that reacted faster than German units could think. German radio messages intercepted after the battle revealed the shock and despair CAS inflicted. "Every road is death. We cannot move. The Jabo waits above us and falls upon us without warning." The Luftwaffe could offer little help. Its dwindling fighter force, stretched across multiple fronts and devastated by the Allied strategic bombing campaign, could not challenge the swarms of thunderbolts dominating the sky. Mortain thus became the moment when CAS emerged not just as a tactical tool, but as the decisive factor in halting a major armored offensive. After Mortain, the retreat of German forces became a rout, culminating in the encirclement at the Falaise Pocket. Here again, P-47s proved indispensable. As German units tried to escape through narrow, congested valleys, TACPs marked choke points, and thunderbolts struck relentlessly. While the legend of Falaise often focuses on the corridor of death, what made the corridor lethal was the uninterrupted presence of thunderbolts overhead, destroying convoys, smashing bridges, and preventing any coordinated breakout. German soldiers described the air attacks as ceaseless and mechanical, as if the Americans had built a machine that turned battlefield sightings into explosions within minutes. When the Falaise Pocket collapsed, the German 7th Army was effectively destroyed. American, Canadian, and Polish ground troops fought ferociously to seal the gap, but they did so under an umbrella of air power that prevented the Germans from maneuvering, reinforcing, or escaping. By the time Allied forces reached the Seine River, the verdict was undeniable. The P-47 Thunderbolt and its air-ground coordination system had transformed warfare in a way no aircraft before it had ever achieved. Normandy had not simply showcased CAS, it had proven that CAS, when executed with speed, precision, and continuous communication, could stop a major offensive, shatter an entire army, and make maneuver warfare impossible for the enemy. Cobra cracked the German line. Mortain broke their counterattack. Falaise destroyed their ability to fight. And through it all, P-47 pilots and their TACP partners demonstrated a truth that would echo through every conflict to come. Air power was no longer a distant hammer. It was a scalpel in the hands of infantry, armor, and frontline commanders. By the time American armored columns rolled across the Seine and raced toward Paris in late August 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had done far more than support an offensive. It had rewritten the rules of warfare. What began as a desperate improvisation in the hedgerows had evolved into a fully integrated system of command, communication, and tactical execution that would form the backbone of modern close air support doctrine for the next 8 decades. The U.S. Army and Army Air Forces, once divided by culture, hierarchy, and doctrine, were suddenly fighting as a unified machine, and the lessons forged in Normandy would become institutional knowledge that shaped Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Afghanistan, and every conflict in America's post-war history. The most important legacy of Normandy was the realization that air power did not need to be centralized to be effective. The 9th Air Force's 9 Tactical Air Command proved that decentralized small unit control, placing the authority to summon aircraft directly in the hands of frontline officers, produced faster, more accurate, and more devastating effects than any top-down system. This idea was revolutionary in 1944. Before Normandy, air commanders believed strike missions needed extensive planning, careful routing, and multi-level approval. After Normandy, the battlefield proved something different. Speed was life. The unit that could see the enemy first and strike the enemy first controlled the battlefield. This lesson became the philosophical foundation of post-war CAS doctrine. In 1946, as the U.S. Army Air Forces transitioned into the independent United States Air Force, after-action analyses from Normandy were circulated among tactical schools. Reports emphasized that the combination of TACPs, shared VHF radio nets, and the cab rank system allowed ground forces to dictate air power in real time. These reports became required study at the Air-Ground Operations School at Pope Field, and later influenced the Tactical Air Command, TAC, formed in 1946. The very idea of a forward air controller, a pilot or airman embedded with infantry to direct strikes, was born in Normandy and formalized post-war. By the Korean War in 1950, the U.S. military was deliberately training FACs, creating the first structured joint air-ground operations doctrine. Just as important was the technical legacy. Normandy proved that an aircraft did not need surgical-guided munitions to perform precision strikes. It needed communication, discipline, and pilots trained to integrate visually with ground cues. The modern 9-line CAS brief, used by JTACs and NATO pilots today, can trace its lineage directly to the shorthand and strike calls used by Normandy TACPs coordinating P-47 attacks. Concepts like marking the target, final attack heading, abort codes, and danger close emerged from the chaotic fields around Saint-Lô. Even the idea of airborne loiter to maintain aircraft overhead specifically for reactive strikes became standard practice. Today's A-10 Warthog, AC-130 gunship, and F-16 CAS procedures all reflect the same fundamental principle as the P-47 cab rank. The aircraft must be waiting on call, not dispatched after the fact. The Normandy experience also reshaped the Army. Generals like Omar Bradley and J. Lawton Collins saw firsthand how air-ground cooperation allowed infantry and armor to advance with unprecedented momentum. After the war, Army field manuals were rewritten to integrate air power into every level of ground planning. The Army realized that tanks alone could not win breakthroughs. They needed vertical firepower to suppress enemy positions and break counterattacks. This synergy influenced the development of helicopter gunships in the 1960s, which the Army viewed as P-47s that could hover. The entire concept of air mobility would have been impossible without the air-ground interface pioneered in Normandy. The psychological and strategic lessons endured as well. German officers repeatedly testified after the war that the constant presence of P-47s shattered their ability to maneuver, resupply, or coordinate. They noted that even small American advances became dangerous because air power could instantly magnify them into breakthroughs. These insights shaped Cold War planning. NATO strategists studying the Warsaw Pact's tank-heavy structure concluded that tactical air power, fast, reactive, and grounded in forward control, would be essential to halting a Soviet advance through Central Europe. The P-47's descendants, from the F-84 to the F-100 to the A-10, were designed with this mission in mind. The fundamental idea of air power as flying artillery was born in Normandy and matured during the Cold War. And beyond doctrine, the legacy of the Thunderbolt pilots lived on in the culture of military aviation. P-47 squadrons in France became symbols of initiative, adaptability, and courage. Their willingness to fly low into forests filled with 20mm flak, their ability to hit targets only yards from friendly troops, and their insistence on staying overhead until the job was done created an ethos that would echo through generations of fighter pilots. A-10 pilots in Iraq and Afghanistan often cited P-47 squadrons as spiritual predecessors. Rugged aircraft, frontline soldiers, shared radios, precision under pressure. The lineage was unbroken. Even more remarkable, many of the pilots who pioneered CAS in 1944 went on to shape the Air Force's tactical doctrine after the war. Veterans of the 365th Hellhawks, the 362nd Mogens Maulers, and the 404th Fighter Group became instructors, test pilots, and commanders in the emerging Air Force. They carried the Normandy lessons with them, embedding them into training syllabi and tactical manuals. Their experiences, improvised under fire, became the professional foundation of American air power. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt had destroyed thousands of German vehicles, smashed supply columns, broken armored counterattacks, and cleared the path for Allied victory. But its greatest achievement was not measured in wreckage or tonnage. It was measured in doctrine. The idea that air power must be integrated with ground forces in real time at the lowest tactical level was the revolution that Normandy forced into existence. And that revolution became the blueprint for every U.S. and NATO operation that followed. The pilots who rolled into Normandy skies in June 1944 thought they were flying missions. In reality, they were inventing the future.